So, welcome all to the second day of the Marine Risk Symposium. Thought yesterday went really well with outstanding keynote address and some very interesting and thought-provoking panels. Expecting the same for today. We'll have opening remarks by Provost Kangaleras, about whom I'll say more momentarily. There'll be a keynote by Rear Admiral Donna Cottrell. Then we'll have a panel in the morning that's on the resilience of the maritime supply chain, just focusing on the fact that maritime transportation is, of course, a critical component of global supply chains, but seem not to be considered in analyses of the same. And so what can we do about it, and what is the resilience of the global supply chain to maritime? So that promises to be quite interesting. And then in the afternoon, we have a panel on the maritime resilience and cybersecurity, which is, near and dear to my heart. And so I'm very excited about having a great panel and a great moderator guiding us through that. But for now, I want to introduce the man who will welcome you all. That's Andreas Kangaleras. He is the M.E. Van Valkenburg Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering and the Vice Chancellor for Academic Chairs and Provost. And I want to emphasize the fact that, he's a scientist and an engineer, and that warms my heart to have a scientist and engineer at the helm of this great university. In fact, it warms my heart to have this particular scientist and engineer at the helm of the university. We have career paths, he and I, that parallel for a while, and then he goes more deeply into administration, and I don't. But we both got our PhDs in 1985. He from in EE from the University of California at Berkeley. Became a fellow of IEEE in 2000. He received the Alexander von Humboldt Research Award in 2005. And an event that will have meaning to a lot of the military folks in the audience. He received the Army Research Lab's Director's Coin in 2011. So those of you who know the coin culture know what a big deal that is, and so that's very impressive. What impresses me in part is Andreas has gone on into administration. When I showed up at the University of Illinois, he had a office that was, on the same floor of the building that I was in, and he was a professor, a full professor as I was, teaching classes, doing research, and so on. Sometime later, he accepted the call to become the department head of the electrical and computer engineering, and I was very grateful for this, that we had someone of his stature and wisdom guiding the department through what at that time was some pretty challenging budget times. Later accepted the call to be dean of the College of Engineering, and he was dean when our center, our DHS center, CERI, was stood up, and we had some startup problems that he was instrumental in help resolving. And so we're very grateful for his participation in that. And he's gone on now to be provost of the university. And in the midst of all this has continued to be, a researcher and engaged in research. And that appeals to me. Not just appeals to me, I'm very impressed by that, because the requirements of these other jobs are so very large. But I think it's important for our own personal growth, and that translates into other things, to still be engaged. So I can tell you that within the last couple of years, I had a conversation, scheduled a phone call with Andreas, which he asked to happen. It was on a Sunday afternoon after he had his research meeting with the graduate students. And I said, Dang, he's the provost and he's having a research meeting with his graduate students. And I heard him say that he was going to teach, is teaching or is going to teach. And so again, so here's an academic, and yet he's at the helm of a great research university. And something else that'll appeal to many of you in the audience, I think, is you know, being in the military, what the importance is of having strong leadership is. And Andreas had, through fire, more to the point, virus, has shown the tremendous leadership that he has had, starting from suddenly we have to figure out how to send the students home and reconstitute our classes online in a very short order. That was last spring. How to manage coming back together and to the extent possible, have face-to-face classes, but still being cognizant of the need for care, and doing that in a way that frankly, University of Illinois is a model for the rest of the nation in the way that we have been managing the COVID virus. And that doesn't happen if you haven't got leadership at the top that helps make that happen, and people that work for the leadership at the top that help makes that happen. So I just have to say that I've been very, very impressed, Andreas, with what it is that you have done for the university, and I'm thankful for that. And with that, I will pass the talking stick to you and ask you to make an introduction to this audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, very much for all your kind words. And good morning to all of you, and welcome virtually to our University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I will tell you, when I heard that we are going to be hosting the 11th Maritime Risk Symposium, I was very excited, and most thankful to our co-sponsors, the United States Coastal Guard, and of course the Transportation Research Board of the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We are fortunate, and let me start by saying that we are fortunate to have at the University of Illinois the privilege to lead one of the centers of excellence of the Department of Homeland Security, especially this one, the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute. Because I remember when we were engaging in conversations with DHS about this, what it became very clear to all of us was the importance of approaching the issue of resilience of the infrastructure of our nation in a way that brings the entire world together. And the best way to do that, the human factor, the government, the private sector, is by starting with having universities lead the conversation. Having universities bring their comprehensive, multidisciplinary expertise and knowledge together to address issues that are critical, pivotal, I would argue, to the success of every nation. And the fact that we have the opportunity to explore the challenges that are with us and will continue to be of infrastructure resilience, working with students, preparing those that tomorrow will have the responsibility to look after the resilience of their communities and the nation, makes all the difference in the world. That's how you advance the society. That's how you advance the well-being of a nation. And we are, again, fortunate to have such a special institute led by the University of Illinois. Let me also say that as I went through the theme of what this symposium covers today, I couldn't help but remind myself that I have seen many of the elements that you're dealing with today and thinking about the concept of resilience as we try to set up an infrastructure here on campus, an ecosystem that would allow us, to the degree possible and in a safest possible way, to continue delivering on the mission of the institution as we navigate the challenges of the pandemic. I will tell you what David said. We have set up what I believe is a tested of how a community like a university like ours, inside a community that is, close to 200,000 people, can function in a way that it continues down the path of its mission while at the same time working with the community, looks after the well-being of the community. We have done it addressing many of the things that are part of your panels today. Supply chain. How do you provide all the means that we need to have in place in order to be able to conduct 50,000 COVID-19 tests per week? Continue to engage and be able to identify individuals who are positive within 30 minutes from the result of their test that we get within 24 hours. How do we work with the local public health district to make sure that all the resources that the community have are part of the thinking as we go about keeping our community as safe as possible, while at the same time providing as some sort of a normalcy in the way we live as a community. Being able to provide our students, everyone learning in some way online, no matter where they are in the nation and the world, continuity in their education and their research, having all the issues of IT privacy, stability that are required to be able to continue down this path. I will tell you, we are a microcosm of the significant challenges that you're dealing with in this symposium, and I will argue that this is the reason why this kind of symposia, this kind of conversations need to start with universities. I know I speak for all of us when I say that one of the things that we have proven as species throughout the history of our history is that moments of desperation are the most creative moments of mankind. And we always come up with solutions. We always figure out what needs to happen in order for us to prevail and continue. But the most important thing is that we reflect on the lessons we learn and the actions we have taken, and we plan for the future. And as I look at the theme of what you're discussing today, it is very clear to me that this is one of the things that you're trying to do. As we look at the future crisis, no matter what it is, how do we make sure that we have the resilience? How do we make sure we have the things that we need to have in place in order to be able to deal with that in the best possible way? For that, I thank you. I congratulate you on being able to come together and have these conversations. I will tell you, it is very important to us that our students and learn from these experiences in a way that what they inherit and what they do with that knowledge is safer and is being done in the best possible way. So, David, thank you very much. Once again, enjoy the rest of the symposium. And I do hope to see as many of you as possible on campus physically, in person, in the very near future. Take care and be well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andreas. And so looking for Mike Parks now. Admiral Parks, are you among us? Okay.
And appreciate the comments of the provost. We all, I think all of us wish we could actually be there on campus. Obviously, I want to, again, commend the organizers of this great event for the opportunity to do this, though, and still carry on. So I am actually making sure that I have not, so let me just double check and ask, Katie or Andrea, if they've actually seen Admiral Cottrell, because I do not have her in my list of participants. So Andrea, do you have her by any chance?
I don't see her listed at this time. She should be here any second, though, I would believe.
Well, I will just take a couple minutes then and say a few things about, first of all, yesterday, great day. Really appreciate everyone's participation and opportunity. And I do see that Ben Cooper, her chief of staff, is with us. So Ben, if you could just make sure the boss knows that we're going to be on Central Time. So she's find her way. That'd be great.
You got it, sir. She's signing in now.
That sounds great. So I'll talk about it before she gets here. And I just want to make a comment. It is going to be great to have yet another dear friend as a as a keynote. And the 9th District that Admiral Donna Cottrell is responsible for covers 8 states, portions of 8 states, and a 1,500-mile international border and almost 6,700 miles of shoreline. She's responsible for 75 different Coast Guard units and has more than 2,600 active duty reserve and civilian employees, as well as almost 3,000 civilian Coast Guard auxiliaries and under her command. Admiral Cottrell is a aviator, which I will respect, because as a ship driver, we know that the aviators, somebody has to go out and get to the newspapers. So I appreciate seriously work with more than 3,500 flight hours in our HH-65 Dolphin helicopters. And I think she just popped on, so that's great. And, it is awesome that she is with us today. And I really do appreciate her topic. The way we're going to run this is she's got a 30-minute video that we'll run, and then afterwards we'll call the two of us back up on the screen. We'll be off camera while the video is running, and then we will do a Q&A. So if you're available to have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or raise your hand, and then we'll run through the questions for as much time as we have that the Admiral is able to be with us. So I can obviously talk a little about the 9th Coast Guard District, having spent a little bit of time there. I'm actually in the 9th Coast Guard District right now. I live in Bay Village, which is a suburb of Cleveland, and retired from the position that Admiral Cottrell holds now 7 years ago. So it's interesting. You become like a used car. You drive off the lot and you become yesterday's news. But I would tell you, we are on our 4th different district commander since I retired, and the Great Lakes is an incredible treasure. I will not steal any of Admiral Cottrell's thunder, but it is a great topic when it comes to resilience because of the seasonality associated with the Great Lakes, as well as the challenges working amongst 8 states and our friends from Canada sharing a 1,500-mile international border. So I would tell you that her talk about resilience and mission readiness in the Great Lakes region will be one that is very, very timely. So I really would expect that I actually got to work with Admiral Cottrell when she was an aviator here in the district when I was a chief of response or operations at the time. So I will tell you that this part of the country, the little-known Great Lakes, a lot of things happen up here when you think about that it is a saltless environment, fresh water. More fresh water is in the 20% of the world's fresh water is in the Great Lakes. And I would tell you that if you took the water from the Great Lakes and spread them out over the continental United States, there'd be enough water for a depth of almost 10 feet. So this is one of the precious natural resources of our nation, if not in the world, the fresh water in the Great Lakes, which makes it a real challenge. And we've already talked about the seasonality and how important it is to be able to realize that we not only have the soft water, but the hard water of the winter. And the Coast Guard doesn't stop what it's doing. So that's something that is really very remarkable, unlike a lot of other parts of the Coast Guard that are able to train and be in the same maritime environment year-round. That's not something that the Coast Guard is able to do. So it looks like, Donna, have you joined us? We have you on screen here yet?
I guess that's it. You're here.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, Admiral Cottrell, thank you for joining us. And I've already given everybody your background and told them what a wonderful person you are and how you have already managed. It's taken about 6 or 7 years to clean up the mess I left, but you've done a great job with that. So I really appreciate that. And as I said, we're going to run through your tape presentation. And there you are, looking pretty awesome. Love all the flags. Donna, you look great.
Thanks.
And it's great to see you.
Good to see you too, Mike.
Before we run for the video, Donna, is there anything you'd like to offer the group before we turn on the video, and then we'll come back and do Q&A afterwards?
I would just say I'm happy to talk to the group and be part of this. I wish we could do it in person. Obviously, we probably all wish that. But this is better than nothing. And so I hope everyone enjoys the remarks and look forward to your questions after.
All right, that sounds great. So we will go off camera and mute. And if you have questions along the way, please feel free to throw them in the chat box, and we'll cover them afterwards. So thank you. And with that, Mike, over to you to run the video.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the Maritime Risk Symposium today. As a Senior Coast Guard Commander for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway, I'm particularly honored to speak with you about the Coast Guard's role in supporting the critical and robust Great Lakes Marine Transportation System, or MTS. My area of responsibility encompasses 8 states, a 1,500-mile international border, and a workforce of over 6,000 Coast Guard active duty, reserve, civilian, and auxiliary men and women. The U.S. Coast Guard is recognized worldwide for its leadership role in the maritime domain. America is a maritime nation, and our waterways, with their wealth of natural resources and marine transportation networks, are vital to our nation's prosperity and security. Our success is linked to our ability to maintain free and open access to the maritime environment for the movement of global commodities, recreation, fisheries, and mineral resources that define who we are as a nation. In this era of rapid technological, environmental, and political change, we must continue to evolve to address emerging threats to life, property, and the environment while mitigating both natural and man-made disruptions to the marine transportation system. First, a little bit about the importance of the Great Lakes. Beginning with the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes Marine Transportation System is a network of interconnected lakes, rivers, ports, and locks, and coastal waterways that permit cargo to move that feeds us, supply the mills and facilities with iron ore and other bulk commodities, and connects us with the global supply chain. Every year, more than 160 million metric tons of cargo are moved on the lake system. More than 40 provincial and interstate highways are linked to 15 major ports and 50 smaller regional ports. This activity sustains 250,000 U.S. and Canadian jobs and generates $35 million in business revenues, as well as $14 billion in wages and salaries. Not only is this mode of transportation vital to our two countries' economies, shipping continues to be the most fuel-efficient and cost-effective way to move goods and people. The maritime mode has the smallest environmental footprint by far, over 5 times more fuel efficient than truck, and 25% more efficient than rail. The 75,000 tons of bulk cargo carried by just 1,000-foot laker would be equivalent to 7 100-car trains or 2,700 18-wheeler tractor-trailers moving it on the highway. In order to simultaneously protect the Great Lakes and facilitate marine transportation, that is, preventing a collision or grounding that could result in a loss of fuel, oil, or cargo, we manage a complex system of aids to navigations along the waterways to ensure ships safely get from point A to point B without incident. As cold temperatures and the hard water or ice season approaches, our buoy tenders remove over 1,200 aids to navigation and replace some of them with a more hardy set of aids that can endure the punishing ice season and continue to guide the ships that remain operational throughout the winter. We work closely with both the Canadian Coast Guard and the St. Lawrence Seaway corporations to maintain this maritime highway. In fact, the Canadian Coast Guard works some of our ice to navigation, and we reciprocate and work some of theirs. As winter season advances, the U.S. Canadian Coast Guard then deploy a fleet of icebreakers that keep most of our critical waterways open, permitting the safe movement of more than $2 billion worth of cargo over an average winter. This past winter was exceptionally mild, however. We averaged only 10 to 12% ice coverage across the entire Great Lakes. The previous winter, however, we had about 70% coverage. The aim of the rest of my remarks today is to provide you with a broad overview of some of the challenges and keys to success the Coast Guard has encountered in supporting resilience across the Great Lakes Marine Transportation System, and the Coast Guard's role in supporting waterway safety, security, and efficiency. First, about personal resilience. Any organization is made up of people. This is where resilience must begin. The Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Coast Guard as a component recognize the challenging and dynamic nature of our mission set to keep America safe, secure, and running efficiently. We also recognize that key to successful and sustained execution of those missions is a safe, diverse, healthy, and resilient workforce. The foundation of operational, organizational, and systematic resilience is a culture that understands flexibility and embraces the concepts of our individual limits and when to seek help. This ensures that we are individually ready to respond to any emergency or contingency at any time and also prepared for long-term response. To this end, the Coast Guard ingrains in all personnel up and down the chain of command to seek a healthy lifestyle and model appropriate work-life balance. DHS mandates annual personal resilience training that teaches members to recognize the signs indicating when either they or one of their coworkers may be experiencing stressors that are beginning to impact performance. It encourages the use of the buddy check system and provides resources to seek professional help or assistance. It is not a sign of weakness to ask for help, but rather a sign of self-awareness to know when you need a hand and the courage to ask for it. Our personnel are encouraged to exercise regularly and are allotted time in their work schedules to do so. With the understanding that we may be called to duty at any moment for long periods, Coast Guard personnel are also encouraged to develop emergency plans and support networks for their families. As leaders, it is our responsibility to ensure our people are prepared to respond to any contingency. As part of my own leadership philosophy guidance to the Coast Guard men and women of the 9th District, I deliberately chose resilience as one of my 3 key watchwords. My message to my leaders and our team is that we will maintain our readiness by taking care of our families, our shipmates, and ourselves. And this is accomplished through informed risk, intestinal fortitude, and active engagement. Informed risk. While we acknowledge much of the work we do can be dangerous, we accept no unnecessary risk. We use sound judgment, utilize risk management and team coordination training to manage risk appropriately, and continually strive to maintain a culture of safety. Intestinal fortitude. We keep ourselves and our families healthy mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Fellowship and connectedness is a vital part of accomplishing this, and I urge personnel to get involved in their communities, to get to know their coworkers, and stay connected with their families. And I expect each member to leave something in the tank for emergencies. And finally, active engagement. I expect each member of the Coast Guard to be an active participant, not a passive spectator. Intervene when needed to protect those in danger, whether it is from the environment, from others, or from themselves. These are the guiding principles that I stress during my unit visits. No one alive has lived through this worldwide pandemic, but we can apply basic leadership principles in our collective experience to overcome this challenge, accomplish our mission, and take care of our people. In full recognition of the importance and value of our system of interconnected, interdependent waterways in our maritime interests, the U.S. Coast Guard is charged with ensuring the maritime safety, security, and stewardship of the U.S. portion of the Great Lakes. As far as how we accomplish these 3 charges, let me share a little background on the U.S. Coast Guard in the Great Lakes. The 9th District, my area of responsibility, runs from Messina, New York, at the first point where the St. Lawrence Seaway touches the U.S., west to the western Minnesota border. My staff in Cleveland support Coast Guard operations on the 5 Great Lakes and beyond to the Lake of the Woods. Across the entire district, we have 2,232 active duty members, augmented by 660 reservists, and we also rely upon 258 dedicated civil servants that provide continuity at certain key positions at the staff and field level. The 9th District utilizes 8 helicopters at 2 air stations in Detroit and Traverse City, Michigan to cover all the Great Lakes by air. We also employ almost 1/4 of all the small boats in the entire Coast Guard. We rely on 187 boats at 47 locations to do much of our day-to-day business on the water. These stations report to 4 large field commands called sectors, 1 in Buffalo, 1 in Detroit, 1 in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and 1 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There are approximately 4.6 million boats registered in the 8 Great Lakes states, which is nearly 1/3 of all the recreational boats in the United States. During an average year, the 9th District saves 587 lives, assists over 7,000 people, and saves more than $12 million worth of property. This year, by the way, we've saved more than 678 lives, a 16% increase so far, due to the massive increase in boating activity related to COVID. To augment our employees, more than 2,500 people volunteer in the Great Lakes Coast Guard Auxiliary. These uniformed volunteers are some fantastic citizens who choose to give back to the community by helping us on the water and even in the air. Their principal responsibility is working with the public, multiplying our outreach by encouraging boating safety and boater education, which measurably reduces risk, prevents casualties, and results in fewer search and rescue cases. Finally, we have 10 Coast Guard cutters, 1 heavy Great Lakes icebreaker, 2 seagoing buoy tenders that can also break ice, and 6 100 140-foot ice-breaking tugs and a 100-foot inland buoy tender. The primary mission of these cutters is ice-breaking and maintaining ASA navigation. The U.S. Coast Guard as an organization is used to responding to natural and man-made disasters such as hurricane and major oil spills. Likewise, we are prepared to respond to many different security threats. We have a robust training and exercise program where we work with communities and industry to ensure we have plans in place to respond to contingencies, and we exercise those plans regularly. One of the hallmarks of the Coast Guard's legacy has always been the principle of flexibility, as documented in our foundational Pub 1. This principle represents the expression of our multi-mission character, arising from a combination of broad authority, diverse responsibilities, small size, and extremely limited resources. The principle of flexibility implies that in order to succeed, we must be able to rapidly adjust to a wide variety of tasks and circumstances. Our units frequently face competing priorities as incidents unfold. Two examples illustrate the point. A cruise ship on fire and drifting toward the rocks is both a search and rescue case and a potential pollution incident. Similarly, an overloaded boat filled with migrants intent on reaching our shores is both a law enforcement and a potential search and rescue case. In each instance, responding units must adapt to the circumstances as they unfold, giving priority to the most critical aspect of the situation at the time. Competing priorities can also be unrelated. There will be times when limited resources will require thoughtful planning to ensure the most critical operations are completed first. Our most demanding challenges require that we conduct surge operations, high-intensity efforts launched on short notice in response to an emergency situation. Significant examples of events requiring surge operations include the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989, the mass migrations from Haiti and Cuba in 1992 and 94, and the massive port security effort following the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001. Surge operations require the Coast Guard to reallocate large numbers of people and assets to respond to these situations. This affects not only the people and units directly involved, but also demands that the entire service adapt to find ways to meet the needs of the surge operation while still achieving critical day-to-day operations. When the Coast Guard surges people and equipment in response to a disaster, it may reduce or defer many planned activities such as marine transportation management, law enforcement patrols, and ports and waterways and coastal security in other operating areas. Upon completion of the surge operation, the Coast Guard must then transition back to normal operations, a process that can take some time, as equipment that was destroyed, damaged, or worn out during surge operation must be repaired or replaced. Surge operations are very demanding, but our ability to flow forces in an emergency provides an enormous benefit to the nation and serves as a testament to our flexibility. Our ability to be flexible accounts for our strategic, operational, and tactical success in our assigned responsibilities. It is why we're able to conduct operations in the most challenging environments and is the means by which we maintain our readiness to answer the call. The challenges presented by the global pandemic are quite different than the typical crisis we respond to. Since we are the Department of Homeland Security, we're also part of the national effort to prevent the introduction and mitigate the spread of the novel coronavirus, or COVID-19. As an organization, the Coast Guard found itself facing a unique situation which required us to remain fully operational to provide service to mariners and preserve the safety and security of America's waterways, while simultaneously and immediately recognizing such activities also increased exposure to our crews and potentially threaten our own resiliency and efficiency to continue performing such missions. But our motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. So in the early stages of COVID-19, we did what we always do. We met emergent needs as they arose, sending medical personnel to airports around the country and cruise ships in California and Florida. We took inventory of the situation and our capabilities, looked closely at risks throughout the region, engaged our community and international partners, and communicated with our crews about safety, resiliency, and mission performance. In the words of the great Wayne Gretzky, we looked to skate to where the puck was going to be and not where it was. Unfortunately, the very real threat of COVID-19 was just beginning to shut down our communities. At the same time, our cutters were working hard to reopen ice-choked waterways in preparation for all major locks and connecting waterways to reopen for the navigation season. Major industries relying on shipment of goods and products from both around and outside the Great Lakes. In March, 8 of our 10 cutters were actively engaged in ice-breaking operations, but the seasonal resetting of over 1,200 summer aids to navigation was still weeks away and hadn't begun yet. We conducted a risk versus gain assessment of the situation and immediately began the process of gradually diverting our multi-mission platforms off the ice-breaking duties and shifting their focus to ASA navigation maintenance. This was a calculated risk, as setting summer aids in waterways that still contain ice is dangerous work and can potentially damage equipment. Nevertheless, we recognize that mariners relied on our floating navigation aids, and that delaying action could mean a risk that floating navigation aids may not be watching properly before the pandemic threatened to cripple cutter crews and tie cutters to the pier. Our flexibility and foresight allowed us to safely set all 1,214 aids safely approximately 1 full month before their advertised availability date. When the St. Lawrence Seaway opened on April 1st, our field units, in concert with other DHS components, Canadian and state agencies, and the Center for Disease Control, already had created a robust team to review inbound vessel traffic, determine their prior ports of call, and assess risks posed by the vessel and its crew or passengers. If crew or passengers had any symptoms, or the ship had been in an impacted region within 14 days, the ship could be denied entry, or the vessel's crew or passengers could be prohibited from going ashore until the 14-day period passed. The Coast Guard captains of the port coordinated quarantine and crew restriction requirements with the CDC. Fortunately, the shipping industry has fully complied with this process, and we have not had any reports of violations. Unfortunately, with a significant community spread taking place in many parts of this country, the risk from foreign seamen is not as great as it was in the spring. Internal to the Coast Guard, we have done well in protecting our workforce. We've only had 26 positive cases across the Great Lakes, and we've ensured those members and any others with potential symptoms or exposure have been cared for and properly quarantined, and thus we've had minimal impact to our operations and readiness. Hundreds of members have been in various stages of isolation or quarantine over the past few months due to exposures and the appearance of COVID-like symptoms, but thankfully we have not lost any members to the illness. Even though the risk to the nation from the maritime mode of transportation is low, we continue to be thorough and diligent when screening the vessels entering the Great Lakes. System resilience. Let me take a brief moment here to amplify a little bit about the importance of the Great Lakes Maritime Transportation System. The Great Lakes system is perhaps unlike any other maritime environment in the world, and that is comprised of the shared internal waters of 2 sovereign nations, around which there are 8 states, 2 Canadian provinces, and dozens of tribal communities, and 86 coastal counties consisting of 6,700 miles of shoreline, and all sharing a 1,500-mile international border. Our maritime border in the Great Lakes stretches the same distance as our southern border traverses from Brownsville, Texas, to San Diego, California. There are no international waters between our nations, only state and provincial borders that extend out into the Great Lakes and to the international border. The Great Lakes represent a massive portion of the American continent. They hold 21%, almost 1/5 of the entire world's fresh surface water, and it is a drinking water for more than 30 million people. The Great Lakes region is also an economic center of gravity for the U.S. and Canada, and a major contributor to our respective economic health and prosperity. Canada and the U.S. are the world's largest trading partners. U.S. goods and services trade with Canada totaled an estimated $718 billion in 2018. Exports were $363 billion, and imports were $354 billion. The region accounts for 60% of the total U.S. and Canada two-way trade, and approximately 1/4 of North America's population lives in states and provinces adjoining the Great Lakes. To summarize, we often fall back on an alliteration to speak to our working environment. It is shared, seasonal, sensitive, and saltless system. Like a lot of our national infrastructure, the marine transportation and harbor infrastructure in the Great Lakes needs maintenance, repair, and recapitalization. Many pier bulkheads, breakwaters, engineered channels, and other structures are well past their design service life. The 15 locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway and Welland Canal around Niagara Falls, and the immense Army Corps of Engineers locks in Sault Ste. Marie are all critical pieces of the system's aging infrastructure. While the Great Lakes are blessed with a large number of ports that provide comfortable level of redundancy for places to receive ships, these locks are critical choke points for the movement of vessels in and out of the Great Lakes. The failure of any one of these locks, either through an accidental or intentional act, would cripple the ability to move cargo on the Great Lakes. No single piece of infrastructure is more critical to the U.S. than the locks operating in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The majority of iron ore, limestone, rock, aggregate, and other bulk material needed by our nation's manufacturing and construction industries pass through those locks. Only one of these locks, the Poe Lock, is capable of handling the 1,000-foot lakers that ply the Great Lakes, and that lock is old and in not so great shape. These locks are ostensibly the Achilles heel of the North American economy. If some disaster were to shut the locks down, 75% of the U.S. steel production would cease within 2 to 6 weeks. 80% of the iron ore mining would stop, as would 100% of the North American manufacturing in appliances and automobiles, as well as construction, farm, and mining equipment. 11 million people in the U.S. and Canada would become unemployed. Millions more would lose their jobs as the U.S. economy entered a recession. The U.S. government has recognized the importance and vulnerability of these locks, and last year began funding the construction of a new post-sized lock adjacent to the 2 existing locks. This $900 million project should be complete in 8 to 9 years. In addition to ensuring the safe navigation of vessels and facilitating trade by water, the Coast Guard has a responsibility of protecting our waterways and its infrastructure through a robust port safety and security program. Facility inspections, fire safety, explosive handling, and pollution prevention are oversight dates back to legislation passed after World War I. Much more rigorous oil and chemical transfer facilities regulations and contingency plans came out of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Vessel and facility security laws and regulations that followed the terrorist attack of 9/11 ensure both vessel and ports facilities are secure. Other pieces of critical infrastructure located along the shoreline, such as bridges, pipelines, electrical grids, refineries, chemical plants, nuclear power plants, and water treatment facilities, are addressed through regional and port-wide maritime security plans. Successfully maintaining a resilient maritime transportation system in the complex Great Lakes is by no means achieved by a flexible Coast Guard alone. On the contrary, and by definition, a resilient waterway system requires cooperative partnerships at all levels. Experience has demonstrated time and again that establishing strong rapport with maritime industry, waterways users, government partners, and other stakeholders prior to an incident or emergency facilitates a smoother and more expeditious recovery. Perhaps the most visible and successful example of such partnerships in the Great Lakes is the international cooperation between the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards. For many decades, we have been working closely together not only to promote safety and enforce security, but also toward mutually beneficial mobility in our shared waterways. This partnership is formalized between us through an official memorandum of understanding at high levels of our governments, but it is executed daily at the operational level. It is not uncommon for a Canadian Coast Guard ship to service a U.S. federal aid to navigation or vice versa. During the ice season, my waterways management staff engages directly with their Canadian Coast Guard counterparts to ensure adequate icebreaking resources are poised to meet the demands of commercial shipping. Our multi-mission platforms, shared goals, and operational interchangeability are a force multiplier. Another intergovernmental example is the partnership between the Coast Guard and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. As I just mentioned, the Army Corps maintains the critical infrastructure linking the waterways of the Upper Great Lakes, as well as the waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system and the heartland of our nation. Orchestrating the maintenance and repair and opening and closing of locks, carefully timed with icebreaking operations, requires communication and an intimate understanding of each other's capability and limits. And it also requires a mutual understanding of our shared customers' needs. Speaking of which, I would be remiss if I did not also point out that the Coast Guard's unique partnership with the commercial maritime industry. The Coast Guard is charged with regulating the safety and security of commercial vessels and waterfront facilities. However, when it comes to mobility and supporting the national economy, the Coast Guard views the commercial industry as a primary customer and partner. As I mentioned earlier, maritime mobility on the Great Lakes has a tremendous impact on the local and national economies, not just for factories, but also through the delivery of products essential to the well-being of communities throughout the winter, including shipments of road salt and home heating oil. Delays are costly and can quickly compound. Yes, the shipping industry needs to make a profit, but we all benefit in keeping costs down, customers happy, and the economy booming. My staff engages with maritime industry leaders year-round, but especially during the ice season. Each year, there is a pre-season conference held jointly with the Canadians to review lessons learned from previous ice season and plan for the season ahead. Once ice begins to impede navigation, there are near daily conference calls with the same parties in order to understand individual needs, constraints, and the best way to employ finite ice-breaking resources to meet those needs across the system as a whole. In the Coast Guard, rarely do we ever conduct an operation alone. Management of the maritime transportation system is no exception. Rather, the interdependence, cooperation, and shared goals of the waterway stakeholders makes waterways resilience a principal product and crucial advantage of well-established professional partnerships. In conclusion, it's been my great pleasure serving as the 9th District Commander representing the men and women who work very hard every day to maintain the resilience of the Great Lakes Marine Transportation System and its citizens on both sides of the border. I hope you all gain an understanding that the Great Lakes are indeed a national treasure and that the Coast Guard's key leadership role in supporting the safe, secure, and efficient maritime commerce. I hope you will take away from these remarks that successful resilience of the Great Lakes is a result of and dependent upon a culture of resilient individuals in our organizations and communities, a flexible and agile multi-mission Coast Guard with clarity of purpose, and strong established partnerships with maritime industry and government stakeholders united in a common goal. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, Donna, thank you so much, Admiral, for those comments, and brought back some memories. I would be remiss if I didn't point out there's certainly a number of our Coast Guard shipmates who have joined the session, and one in particular I need to point out, Donna, just so you're aware, somebody who kind of helped mentor me about the Great Lakes. What I wanted to say is our own Admiral John Crowley, United States Coast Guard retired, has joined us as well. So we got to be very careful because it's like Dad's in the house. So, but Donna, thanks for those great remarks, and brought, like I said, a trip down memory lane about the Great Lakes. So we do have a question in the chat. And if you have any other questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand so that Admiral Cottrell can get to them. But what I'd like to offer is our first question is, would you, Admiral, please comment on the Coast Guard's plan to recapitalize the river buoy tender and icebreaker fleets?
Sure, Mike. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you
Sound
loud.
check? Okay. I do want to comment that while the whole videotaping thing was a little bit painful, I think for all persons involved, while you were listening to me speak, there's a fire drill here. So you know what that's like, right? In the background, it just kept going, and they just finished up. They just wrapped up. So we'll be thankful.
Perfectly timed, Donna. That's perfect.
Right. Yeah. But anyway, to answer that question, and welcome to Admiral Crowley. Admiral Crowley was the district commander when I was the XO in Detroit, so I do remember him. So welcome to him. So the Waterways Commerce Cutter, or the river tenders, we have one of those, 100-footers, the Buckthorn, up in Sault Ste. Marie. And so we are planning to get 25 new, we're recapitalized for 25 of those eventually. And right now there's funding for design and construction in FY22. Of course, all this is, future, so we know how the budget works, with potential delivery of the first one in 2024. I doubt that we're going to be the first one to get it. The Mississippi River, the D8 units are much more dire need of those. As far as the icebreakers go, so the first one is under construction. It was awarded to Halter Marine. And then the second one of the heavy icebreaker, the Polar Security class, is approved in the president's budget for 21. But of course, we don't have appropriations yet. We're still under a CR. So the second one is, in limbo right now. So that's the status of those. And then the Arctic Security Cutter, which we call the medium icebreakers, we're looking at those in out years, and they're in the design phase. Well, actually, they're pre-design. And then I also just want to comment on the 140s that we use, the icebreaking tugs here in the Great Lakes. So we have 6 of those. We really need to recapitalize those. That's to me, I think that's our Achilles heel. And so that's right now they're in the requirements phase of looking at recapitalizing the 140s, but very early in that process. Somebody just raised their hand.
Yeah, so that's Allison Bennett. Allison, would you jump on camera and offer your question to Admiral Cottrell?
Sure, thanks. And I put it in the chat as well, just in case we have some comms issues. But one question that I had was, as a decision maker during COVID, are there any supply chain questions that you were asking that are still unanswered? And I asked this in the vein of, driving what type of systems and tools that researchers should focus on, and so that we are able to meet decision makers' needs during the next major disruptive event.
Well, supply chain issues plagued us and still continue to plague us, just in terms of, a lot of different kinds of industry just sort of shut down for a while. And so we had, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, we have one example where we were supposed to get some new piers built up in Sturgeon Bay, floating piers, right? Mm-hmm. And evidently the people that make the floating piers kind of shut down their assembly line for a couple months, and so that pushed that whole project back, which actually affected us during the summer, because if the station doesn't have a pier to moor the boat at, they have to moor it somewhere else. So a lot of those questions remain. We still have supply chain issues within our aviation community across the Coast Guard. Some of that's COVID related, some of it's separate from COVID, but COVID doesn't help. And I think I answered part of your question. Do you want to clarify the rest of it? I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I was curious in the sense that, I think sometimes, as we're researchers and doing work, we forget about some of the, actionable questions and data that someone in your position would need. So I was just curious if there was anything else supply chain related that fits into that bucket.
Allison, that's a really good question. And my chief of staff just pointed out, there's other entities, other stakeholders within the Great Lakes. It's kind of it's a team effort. So, for example, the PPE question was a big deal in the beginning, trying to get enough N95s, and then who really needs them. And then, the pilots need PPE, but it's a private company, and we don't provide, PPE to private entities. So, but everybody was kind of drinking from the same fire hose, or actually it wasn't really a fire hose, it was more like a trickle in the beginning. So everyone's trying to drink from that same supply chain at the same time in the beginning, and that created a little bit of tension, which I think we've solved that as far as the, protective gear and the masks issue. And we make sure our crews, when they're in contact with the public, they're wearing the N95s, but around work and that sort of thing, we wear the fabric masks. So just to save that, but thank you.
So Donna, maybe you could add to Allison's questions just a bit by maybe sharing with the audience what you do on a daily basis and what information is briefed to you on a daily basis to help try to ascertain, as the Great Lakes decision maker in the maritime domain, what kind of information you get from your staff and the field units that might help also answer Allison's question.
Okay, no, that's good. Thanks for that kind of clarification, because a lot of times you kind of take it for granted what I do, and people know that, right? So I get briefed every day on what kind of cases we had the day before, but more importantly, to prepare for today, prepare for the next search and rescue case or the next commercial vessel that runs aground. I want to know what assets I have available and where they are. And so that would include all of my small boat stations, my rescue stations. That would include all of my cutters. So I have, in the summertime, I have 47 small boat stations, which is the most of any district in the Coast Guard. That's summertime because we have smalls that we open up seasonally. And then I have, 6 140 icebreakers, 100-foot, the Buckthorn up in the Sault Ste. Marie, 2 225s, and then, of course, the Mackinac. So I want to know the status of all those, where they are. And then I have 2 air stations, and I want to know the status of the aircraft. So, for example, during this summer, we had so many hurricanes down in D8, and we were a donor to, providing air support and others, personnel down in D8 to help with the hurricane recovery or rescues, and we provided an H-60 out of Traverse City. So managing those air assets and making sure we still have coverage on the Great Lakes is something that we pay attention to every day, and it's a moving target for sure. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Sure, that's great. And we just have another question, and I just want to make sure I get the right hand here. Why don't you jump on and tell us who you are and share your question, please.
Admiral, great talk. Following up on your comments about PPE, have you found any conflicts with the specialized equipment that the Coast Guard operatives do, like we do search and rescue and things like that, with the COVID PPE requirements?
You mean in terms of performing the mission?
Yeah, or if there are, we were talking with electric utilities at another meeting last week, and they were saying a big issue that they have faced is that, especially if they're doing electrical repair, they have to be in completely fire-resistant materials, right. And that they have had very serious issues trying to find fire-resistant COVID PPE.
Yeah, okay, I understand your question. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we wear, like I said, when we have in contact with the public, the crews wear the N95. Air crews do wear regular, cotton masks or fabric masks. I think, there's times where they have to take it off just because, you maybe can't hear somebody, like if you're hoisting and the flight mechanic is, exposed to the wind and it's hard enough to hear him, so he or she may have to take the mask off. But we haven't had any major issues with, like, I can't wear this right now and do my job, right? We haven't really seen that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I do want to comment on one more thing about, what am I paying attention to? One of the things I'm paying attention to is how many COVID cases I have in the district at any given time. So, not only positives, and we haven't had that many positives over time. I think it's less than 20 cumulative.
More now.
A little bit more now. But at any given time, there's a lot of people either in isolation or quarantine, and usually they're spread out. But sometimes, especially on a cutter, if one person is COVID positive, they're going to be exposed to a lot of other people because you literally cannot maintain that physical distance on a cutter. I mean, it's not possible. So then more people have to go into quarantine. So that's definitely something I pay attention to. So go ahead, Mike.
Well, that sounds great. And while I'm waiting for anyone else to offer a question, I just offered you an opportunity to maybe share just a little more about your relationship in this time as we're talking about maritime resilience, your relationship with the industry, and how that really provides you an opportunity to partner with them. You talked about partnerships, obviously critical up, not around the organization, but certainly up on the Great Lakes as much as anywhere. But maybe perhaps you could share a little bit about what you're doing with regard to your partnership and your work with the industry.
Sure. Well, it so happens that we have the ICE conference that begins tomorrow, Great Lakes ICE Conference, and it starts out with us and the Canadians meeting. We're going to meet tomorrow. It's virtual. And we'll talk about, upcoming ice season. We'll get predictions from, what it might look like this year. We'll get updates on resources. What do our resources look like in terms of icebreakers? And then on Thursday, we'll meet with industry. And that's a broader conversation. They'll tell us a little bit about, what they're seeing, in terms of their moving of commodities and so forth. Last winter was very different. Number one, it was a light ice season. And then later in the season, once we came out of the ice season and they started moving, there just wasn't as much. And then I guess then the other example of, we're meeting with, I'm meeting with the Passenger Vessel Association, is it week after next?
Yes, ma'am.
Week after next, virtually. So a lot of discussion with them about illegal charters, which is a big issue in Chicago and more, it's starting to be an issue in Detroit area with just, private owners taking people out for hire, which is dangerous because they don't necessarily pass the safety inspections and so forth. So we work with industry on that. So just a couple examples. And as far as throughout the ice breaking season, where we have daily calls with the Lakers, and talk about the critical areas where we need to send resources to, and we partner with the Canadians and the St. Lawrence Seaway on that.
Well, great, thanks. And it's interesting you're talking about what might be illegal bareboat charters. And I remember being a Lieutenant JG 35 years ago, dealing with that same issue in Southern California. So some things never change; they just maybe change their location. So thanks for that. There's a question from retired Coastie that you'll appreciate, and it's probably one that you get quite frequently, and that is, what do you see as the biggest threat to the maritime infrastructure on the Great Lakes? And I think you touched on it, but please hit that again if you would.
On the Great Lakes, I would say right now the high water and the damage that it's doing, and it doesn't. I was at a land area conference last week, and the point that I made to the land area commander and the other district commanders is, flooding it doesn't just come in and do the damage while it's there. It leaves and undermines things, the foundation, the basements, and then of course all of our small boat stations are on the water, and so the water, we're seeing a lot of the flooding is wind driven, but we're also seeing a lot of the high water table. The water's coming up through the basements, so I'm seeing a lot of that. So I think that's our biggest threat to our infrastructure. And then the piers, we're seeing sinkholes and piers in different places, which reduce the weight capacity of the pier, then reduces what ships can tie up there, and cranes and moving buoys. So to me, that's the biggest threat.
Well, thanks. And I guess I just chuckle when you say lake levels, because I just remember somebody shared with me an article that was written about 7 years ago when I was asked that very same question, and I answered it the same way. I said lake levels, but at the time, 7 years ago, as you remember, it was low lake levels. And
right.
I didn't expect that you would solve that problem so well. But
careful what you ask for, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another great question has come in, and that is, are there lessons learned from your experience, Admiral, that might extend to the PACOM AOR, Pacific Area Command AOR, or the South China Sea scenarios?
Wow.
Going to have to go out to your GIATF West days.
Yeah, I'm like rolling the tape back there. Well, I think it's a little different because, in terms of water levels, because just because the lake, it does fluctuate more, right? We did have the low levels a few years ago, and if you look at the cycle over the 100-year time period, it looks like about every 5 years it's pretty much of a sine wave. But we do see, I think the lows are getting lower and the highs are getting higher. In the Indo-PACOM region, I mean, the islands out there, it's sort of a accidental threat to some of those islands in terms of the water levels coming up, and we don't have the threats like in terms of fishing so much. The food scarcity, that's a big deal for some of those Oceania nations. I'm getting notes from my chief of staff. And then as far as, the engagement. What does the chief of staff do? He hands me notes. The engagement is a good example, like lots of engagement with Indo-PACOM, with the islands, especially with the Coast Guard. One of the things I saw there is that, the Coast Guard is much more of a demand. There's much more of a demand signal for the Coast Guard for white hulls than there is for gray hulls, because a lot of those nations, their navies are more like Coast Guards, and because of the tenuous relationship that they have with China, they don't want to necessarily be seen as kind of friendly with the military part of the DoD part of the U.S., but having relationships with the Coast Guard is a good thing. And I think, our engagement with the different states, and really, I think our engagement, the most important aspect of our engagement takes place at the local level. Like I said, we have 47 stations in the summertime, and those officers in charge are, they're chiefs or they're warrant officers, and the folks there in those little towns, they're involved in the PTA or coaching the kids, teams, and they know the fire chief by name and the police chief, and those partnerships are just so important. So I kind of went off on a little tangent there, but that's what I got.
No, that's great. I certainly appreciate that. Speaking of partnerships, yesterday we had a great panel. Captain Todd Bonner from our Canadian Armed Forces was part of moderated a panel, and I just think that as I look at those flags that are arrayed behind you, right next to the Old Glory is the Canadian flag. Can you maybe share a couple thoughts on your relationship and partnership? Because obviously in the South China Sea, for example, there are some other states actually very, very different in our partners to the north.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a way different relationship. Well, we have a great relationship with the Canadians, both Transport Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard. I was just had a phone conversation with the commissioner, the Canadian Coast Guard commissioner, and we talk. I wouldn't say frequently, but we talk regularly. And ice breaking is a really good example. They have 2 icebreakers that they throw into the fight for the Great Lakes. Sometimes we break ice in Canada, and sometimes they break ice in the U.S. It just kind of depends on who's the closest. So that's a great relationship. And then we have another good example of our work with the Canadians is for maritime. We'll say like maybe environmental issues or groundings, those kinds of things. So we exercise the CAN-US SLAC. It's an annex of our area contingency plan where we work with the Canadians. And we exercised it, I think, 4 times for real last summer with the various groundings. And, a lot of people don't maybe realize that, the Great Lakes, all but Michigan share a border. There's a border that goes through the Great Lakes, except for Michigan, which is all in U.S. waters. And there's no international waters in between. It's either U.S. waters or it's Canadian waters. And so when something happens, let's say a ship goes aground and there's risk of oil leaking, everybody cares about it, because the water there's no purple line that you can see in the water. So we have a great relationship with them in terms of responding to any kind of incident like that, and it's pretty seamless.
Well, that gives birth to that alliteration you used, shared and seamless and sensitive and saltless. That's
right.
Great use of that, and that partnership with Canada is really one of those opportunities to really bring that to bear, and it's certainly a model for other nations. Unfortunately, not everyone has that kind of great relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
So, could I ask you, Admiral, based on your experience, as you're, rolling into your, as they like to say, the back 9 here of this opportunity, what advice would you give to your successor, or maybe what advice would you give that maybe you wish you'd had been given?
I think I got good advice from Admiral Noonan coming in. I think I would give similar advice, and that is to get out of the office and go visit the units and talk to people firsthand. I think that's been the most valuable. Yeah, just to get out to see them. And, it's one thing to, when the worst of the flooding, this was 2 summers ago now, the summer of 19, when we had the worst of the flooding, and I'm seeing pictures, and I'm like, well, that looks really bad. But then I go to the unit and the pictures just don't do justice to what's really happening, and to talk to an actual human in person and have them explain to me, how the flooding affected them, that goes a long way, and being able to really tell the story and advocate for folks. So I think that was that's been the most important aspect of my job, and I'm continuing to. I've only got a handful of units that I haven't been to yet, and I'm going to try to take care of those in the next couple months. So I would say that, and then just to continue to advocate within the Coast Guard for the importance of the Great Lakes Maritime Transportation System. I don't think a lot of people understand how important it is in terms of its own individual economy and how much goods and services are moved up here, and the importance of keeping that vibrant and alive.
That's great. So Don, I'm the father of 2 daughters, one of whom wants to be a helicopter pilot, which me is killing me.
That is awesome. That is awesome.
It's killing me at my core.
Yeah.
But seriously, what advice would you give to a young woman who might want to join the Coast Guard or any other service to become a pilot?
Well, let me start out with the Coast Guard, and I would say this to a young man or a young woman, and that is, if you join the Coast Guard, I think your first motivation needs to be a member of the Coast Guard, whether it's enlisted or officer, right? Because flight school is kind of getting picked up for aviation is kind of it's not a sure thing, right? There's just a lot of things that can disqualify someone that they have absolutely no control over. I look for people when I used to do boards for flight school, and I would always ask them, so why did you join the Coast Guard? And, or why do you want to be in the Coast Guard? And I want to hear, because I'm interested in the mission, and I'm interested in serving my country, and I'm interested in, being on the water, and I'm interested in being a Coast Guard officer. If they really narrow in too much on one particular aspect, then I get a little bit concerned, because they may not be able to do that. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing is, I think the Coast Guard is a great meritocracy. And I think, and I'm a great example of that. I came in, I had, mediocre, pretty much everything in high school and college. I just, there wasn't a whole lot of things that I excelled at, but, once I got into the Coast Guard, I found that if I worked hard and did my job, that, I was able to move up. So, that's to me, that's the best thing about the Coast Guard, is just the opportunities that it's afforded me, and it affords anybody who's willing to apply themselves.
Well, Donna, you sell yourself short, as you typically do. I would say that rarely is there anybody who that I see that has a set of wings as well as a coxswain pin. So good for you. Just for everybody's benefit, I was going to mention to Admiral Cottrell that our sympathies are with her and the rest of the naval aviation community. The 2 naval aviators lost their life the other day in a training accident. A naval flight instructor and actually a Coast Guard ensign who was the student perished in an aviation accident. So our thoughts and prayers go out to their families and the entire service. That is always a tragedy when we lose a service member, and people don't typically remember that what men and women in the armed forces do every day is dangerous, and the training for that is equally dangerous. So our hearts and prayers go out to those families. Donna, you're back.
Well, I'm kind of back. I'm up. I had to go back to the Chief of Staff's computer. He was on. So I don't know if you can see me.
No. So Donna, I can't see you. You are looking pretty fuzzy there, but
I don't know what that is.
I did want to offer our best wishes and our condolences actually to you and the entire community, the aviation community, the naval aviation community, for your loss of a flight instructor, and obviously the Coast Guard ensign who was a student. Obviously what you do every day is dangerous, and the training for that is equally as dangerous. So our thoughts and prayers with you and the entire community on that loss. And before we close out and move on to our next panel, is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Donna, please?
Well, I appreciate those thoughts, Mike, and yeah, it's hit some folks hard. I have a couple of people on my staff that were, classmates with the ensign, and she was a topic of the all flags yesterday. And of course, I don't know if you know about it, but we had a BM1 who lost his wife and 2 children in a fire down in Cape Hatteras. In Coast Guard privatized housing, but previously Coast Guard housing, and that was a tragedy there, and also a Coast Guard civilian. So it was a tough weekend for us, but I appreciate your thoughts on that. And I just thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I really apologize for the technical difficulties here, but hopefully folks got something out of it.
Well, thanks, Donna. We certainly did, and appreciate that, and give our best to Ben for his work. Chief of Staff's work is never done, so you can tell him to upgrade the video. One of your
okay, tell him to upgrade. Okay, got it. I'll tell him.
Thanks very much, and you stay safe, and best wishes, and I hope to see you on the street somewhere soon.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Okay, take care.